Hello and welcome. The historic struggle for Palestine is characterized as the claims and counterclaims of Arabs and Jews. But one often overlooked factor behind the birth of Israel and the Palestinian Nakba, the catastrophe, is the part played by an old imperial power, Britain. Whose interests were best served by the British in Palestine? How did it honor its mandated duty of care? And what were the calculations and miscalculation it made in redrawing the map of Palestine and reshaping its history? Well, the 67 words of the Balfour Declaration and the 65 years of Israeli statehood continue to cause conflict and controversy. If history is written by the victors, who are the rewriters of history as new information, new documents, new historians come to light? After a century of British involvement in Palestine, it is time to take stock of the cliches and propaganda that serve competing interests and examine how history itself is the battleground for the hearts and minds of new generations today. To discuss the historic events that led to the Nakba, the birth of Israel, and the making of history, we are joined here in London by Rosemary Hollis, Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at City University, London, and former head of the Middle East program at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, also known as the Chatham House. James Renton, Senior Lecturer in History at Edge Hill University and author of The Zionist Masquerade, The Birth of the Anglo-Zionist Alliance. And last but not least, Avi Shleim, Emeritus Professor of International Relations at Oxford University, author of Collusion Across the Jordan, King Abdullah, the Zionist Movement, and the Partition of Palestine, and more recently, Israel and Palestine. But first, to mark the 65th anniversary of Al-Nakba, Al Jazeera has been airing a special series on its roots and ramifications.
The outbreak of World War I in 1914 created new opportunities to reshape the Middle East.
خلال الحرب البريطانيين كان يفكروا عن الموقع فلسطين على قرب من قناة السويس ودور بريطانيا في مصر آنذاك كان يدل على دور خاص لبريطانيا في فلسطين، ورأوا في اليهود وفي الحركة الصهيونية شريك في أمر استراتيجي استعماري.
In 1917, the British cabinet, headed by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, pledged to establish a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Britain was represented by Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Arthur Balfour. A delegation from the Zionist organization attended, headed by Chaim Weizmann. They presented a map, seen here, proposing the area to be allocated for a Jewish homeland. In 1922, the League of Nations formalized British rule in Palestine. The second clause of the British Mandate document, approved by the League of Nations, stipulated, "The British Mandatory shall be responsible for placing the country under political, administrative and economic conditions that will secure the establishment of the Jewish national home." British High Commissioner Herbert Samuel decreed Hebrew as an official language of Palestine alongside Arabic and English. The letters E and Y were added to the word Palestine in Hebrew as an abbreviation of the words Eretz Yisrael, meaning land of Israel.
وحموا الوكالة اليهودية التي كانت شبه حكومة لليهود أيام الانتداب وأعطوها كل المساعدات العسكرية والمادية وساعدوا على إخفاء نفسها، فهي مهارة صهيونية، مؤامرة بريطانية، وإلى حد ما وآسف أن أقول غباء أو بساطة عربية فلسطينية.
In the 1930s, the number of Jews immigrating to Palestine began to increase significantly. From 4,000 in 1931, the figure jumped to 9,500 the following year. In 1933, the number rose to 30,000. In 1934, 42,000, and in 1935, a further jump to 62,000.
الإنجليز حطوا مخيع، حطوا مين؟ حطوا المركز بل هذا على الطريق.
هذه الأراضي عم بتروح، الوعد عم ينفذ، غياب أي تفاعل معها من الحكم البريطاني في قمع وفي بطش وفي قوانين رهيبة في الحكم البريطاني.
In 1945, following the end of World War II, US President Harry Truman appeared to encourage the Zionist agenda by recommending the 100,000 displaced Jews in Europe be allowed to emigrate to Palestine. In February 1947, Britain announced the decision to end its mandate in Palestine. Its spokesman said his country would turn over the difficult situation to the United Nations. Britain was now washing its hands of Palestine, setting in motion events that would lead towards the momentous year of 1948.
Gentlemen, Rosemary, welcome. Rosemary, let's start with you. So here we had a declaration that basically promised a national homeland for the Jews in Palestine. What basically motivated the Balfour Declaration? From reading all of your writings, apparently there is an evangelical angle, there's a Zionist angle, there's a colonial angle, perhaps a humanitarian angle. Let's start with the evangelical. Is there an evangelical roots for that declaration?
For those British members of the British establishment at the time who were Christian with an evangelical bent, yes, but I think it's important to recognize that the man who penned the original letter to Lord Rothschild, in other words, Lord Balfour, was not motivated by an evangelical Christian mission. In fact, at the same time as he was writing that letter, he was also shepherding through the British Parliament a piece of legislation which would limit Jewish immigration to Britain.
But is there a contradiction between promising national homeland for the Jews in Palestine and passing laws that are not friendly to Jews in England?
There's no contradiction whatsoever. In fact, they were mooting the idea of a Jewish homeland somewhere else in the empire. The British were in imperial vein. They thought it was okay to organize the lives of other people, to move groups around. They were busy in the First World War anticipating moving people from the Indian subcontinent to Mesopotamia, what became Iraq. They thought that was what you do.
It's all part of the empire.
Exactly.
James, what I've read of Arthur Balfour is that he thought of himself as an instrument of the divine intervention, as a mystic Christian of sort.
I think the religion aspect, to a significant extent, is a red herring. It was a profound contribution to the reason why members of the British establishment were so readily able to accept one of the key tenets of Zionist ideology, that the Jews were a nation, an ancient nation. Mm-hmm. They saw Palestine as the Holy Land, mm-hmm. as the Promised Land, as the landscape of the drama of the Bible. Probably the primary reason for the Balfour Declaration was propaganda, in that in 1917 the British government was desperate to stem the tide of pacifism in Russia, the tide of revolutionary socialism in Russia, and to try to keep Russia in the war. At the same time, they were desperate to try to mobilize the full resources of the United States in the conflict. And it was believed in the British establishment that Jews held tremendous power in Russia and also in the United States.
Does that smell of a bit of anti-Semitism?
Absolutely. It was shaped by an anti-Semitic belief
that the Jews control centers of power.
In Jewish influence.
Before we go to the Jewish influence, and on the question of evangelism, Avi?
I think there is a view that the Balfour Declaration was inspired by knowledge of the Bible, sympathy for the Jews, and recognition of the Jews as an ancient nation. And according to this view, Zionism was a noble project, and the Balfour Declaration was a noble and altruistic move on the part of the British government. I completely reject this explanation of the motives behind the Balfour Declaration, and it seems to me that the driving force behind the Balfour Declaration was not the Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, but the Prime Minister David Lloyd George. And the timing is significant. November 1917, when Britain was not doing at all well in the First World War, and Britain was anxiously looking for allies from any quarters it could find. And the support for Zionism was based on a misperception of the British political elite, and by Lloyd George in particular. Lloyd George thought that the Jews were a really powerful force in world politics. He thought that the Jews made the wheels of history turn, and therefore by issuing this declaration in support of Jewish national aspirations in Palestine, he would acquire a really powerful ally in the war.
I think we have to be very careful about a distinction between the British desire to try and enlist the what they imagine to be the weapon for warfare of winning over Jewish world opinion during the conflict and imperial designs. There were some members of the British government who thought that Zionism would be a useful way to try to secure British control of Palestine after the First World War. Now, there was a general consensus in the British government that obtaining control of Palestine was an